Hi everyone, James here from F9 Audio and welcome to this walkthrough of our TRAX release, Motion V1 Tech House for Ableton Live 9.1 onwards. This is one of the most advanced TRAX releases we've done so far and we've got a ton to get through. But as always with TRAX, you get 5 main projects. This is one of them. This is Southbank. As always with TRAX, we've done as much as we possibly can using MIDI parts, sound menus and multi-sampled instruments. And we've got some great content to show you in this release as we go through this walkthrough. But every single one of the main project files also has a corresponding beats-only startup page. So if you like the sound of the drums on one of the pages and the instruments that are in it, but you want to start afresh, you can quickly open that up and just start working with the instruments pretty much set up and ready to go. There are also 2 additional startup pages preloaded with sounds and some basic MIDI parts to give you an idea of some of the sounds that are available within this pack. This is the one in D minor. We also have this completely blank startup page with no MIDI information on there at all, but it's loaded with instruments, so you can just pull it straight up and start creating. We've also added this project in session view that contains all of the additional loops that were created for this pack that are available for customization. Now, please note also all of the WAV loops are available within the folder structure and they're pre-warped. So the .asd files are next to them. You can just drop them into the project and they will sync. We've got all sorts in here, including tops loops from the Electron Digitakt, process vocal loops in the 2 main keys, D minor and G minor, percussion, and some filthy low-bit house loops. Now, as I hope you know, we're dedicated to bringing you far more than just static loops and samples. And in this release, we've got 127 live racks for you to install into your system. They contain drum menus, sound menus, multi-sampled analog hardware, digital hardware, and a whole host of brilliant one-shot patches that were put together specifically for this release, but more on them later on. Now, I really recommend that once you've got this pack, go through every single one of the racks and have a good look around the sound library. Particularly with the synths, there are actually more patches than are used within the project. Now, before we move back to the main project, I just want to talk about these SP1200 basses that we created for this pack. We've noticed some really characterful bass going on within Tech House output across the world. And even though it's got a lot of sub-information, there's often a lot of note as well, and that's quite difficult to achieve. So we came up with a really interesting process where we took our original EMU SP1200 and sampled a load of bass notes into it, then often repitched them, fired them back through our analog hardware to bring out as much useful bass as possible whilst making sure the sub-content was there. Then we placed the resulting audio back into Kontakt, resampled again so that we could transfer them into these live racks. We're really pleased with the results, and in the sound library they are F9 SP12 basses A to Q. Okay, back to our project Southbank and let's have a quick look at the drums. Now let me show you, this is pretty much running in MIDI. We do have some audio files throughout the pack and we'll go through them later on. But this one in particular is using the drum sound menus. Now they're all racked up and they're using simplers, so that makes this pack completely compatible with Live Standard and Live Suite. Now don't forget that if you're a Suite user, you can come down to any of the simplers here, right click on the top bar of the simpler or control click on a Mac and select Simpler to Sampler and it will swap over. Nothing will change sonically because underneath the different wrappings it's exactly the same piece of code, but you will now have access to all of this additional sound design. Now let's have a look at the kicks. They're really nice and fat. They've actually been processed very carefully through an original BBC spec Studer A80 master tape machine. Now, just above that, there is one additional kick part that's very simple. It's a 4-bar loop and it's going throughout the entire length of the track. And this is our sidechain trigger. Now, we've pulled it off the main master bus, so you're not actually hearing it. And we've done that by coming over to its output routing and just selecting sends only. So that takes it off the master bus, but it's still playing and it can be picked up at any point by any of the sidechain inputs. Now, one thing I do want to say whilst we're actually just on the bass end of one of these productions, I know a lot of producers are actually struggling getting the bass end right. Trust me, you are not alone. Every single producer struggles pretty much on a daily basis with getting the bass right, because we're pushing the audio file format right to its limit with mixing and mastering. Now, we've left everything open here so you can see what we're doing. So all of the plug-in chains are open, and we're not actually doing too much here, but on certain tracks we have had to do a lot to make everything fit. Now, no matter how much kind of pre-production you do on your bass-heavy parts, you're probably going to need to have a little bit of a food fight to actually get them working in a track. So don't think that you're doing anything wrong if you do. If you do have a pair of headphones, I would highly recommend that you sometimes switch between them and your monitors whilst you're actually working on your bass end. The reason being, they put you in a designed acoustic space, which can often be better than the non-treated rooms that most of us are working in. And not only that, they tend to go much lower in terms of frequency, so you can really hear with a pair of headphones what's going on with your subs. Now, let's have a look at some of the drum menus that we've actually got, as well as the main bread and butter sounds, the kicks, hats and claps, which I'm sure we don't really need to go through here. We've got these excellent selection of loop chops. Now, they've been pulled through a variety of low-bit samplers, so they've really got some grit and some grunge. We've got some great jacking snares. And whilst we're on this patch, let's have a quick look at some of the macro controls that are available on every single drum patch. We've got this release control. Perfect if you want to emulate that kind of old sampler effect where sometimes the samples were cut really, really tight. Snap, this actually uses a parallel processing chain. And it brings in some parallel compression. Now, we very carefully controlled the volume level so it doesn't rise in level. You just actually bring more of the transient forward of the sound. We'll have that about halfway, and now we'll add some drive. That uses the built-in drive from the actual sampler. Velocity sensitivity, we thought that was vital to add to drum parts. Some people like programming with that turned off. Some people like to be able to draw velocities in. And 2 classic filter controls. So we've got a nice set of basic sound sculpting functions there available straight on the macros. Some of the patches that we're really proud of here on this release are the live tambourine and live shaker patches and menus. We went to great lengths to work out the best way to record these kind of instruments, as often they can be incredibly sharp, brittle if you're using just normal vocal mics. And we found that using Cole's 4038 BBC spec ribbon mics and some very careful preamping and EQ whilst we did them resulted in some really excellent patches. Now you can hear we've got multiple hits for each tambourine or shaker instrument, so it's quite possible to really build up quite live sounding parts, and they really help drive this rhythm track along. Now, just a couple of quick notes on the actual mixing of this. If we flip over to session view, you'll see that all of the faders are pretty much around 0. Now, the most useful part of an audio fader is at 0 dB due to the fader's logarithmic nature. So if whilst you're mixing, you can get your actual output level of any track around 0, then it's going to be really easy to mix and to balance and to get things right. The way to do that is to use things like, if you're using a grouped track or a racked track, is use the actual output of that rack, or go to EQ plugins and use the gain control at the back end. You can actually balance there. So say if on this tambourine you're mixing and your fader is at about -10 dB, you could duplicate that on the final EQ output of the track, say by -10 there, and then bring this back up to 0. But I can't tell you what a difference this will make to you once you actually start mixing. Okay, now let's have a look at the bass. Now we've got a different set of rack controls for the bass instruments. The first two are pretty self-explanatory: attack and release, output level, great once you're actually starting to balance things, low pass filter control. We've also got this spread control that will, using the simpler plugins, internal spread, it will actually take two versions of the sound, de-pitch them slightly and start to move them out in the stereo image. We're only using a touch of it here, but now I'll whack it up to some extremes. And we've actually got a frequency modulation control that can get quite wild when you really turn it up. And you can control the modulating pitch with this next control. And the FM decay controls the decay portion of a very simple envelope controlling it. So a great selection of tones just available out of that simple macro. Now I've duplicated the entire bass channel, and on the second channel we've got quite a high degree of roll-up. You can see here it's actually set at 87.2, which is taking quite a lot of bass off. Now what we're doing is pulling the bass part onto that channel every now and again, and it will just remove some of the bass and waiting for it to slam back in on when you come to the next section. Let's hear it in solo. Now we're doing the same here with the kick. There's a filtered version of the kick. So when I actually, let's solo all of these together so you can hear all the bass end instruments doing the same thing. And when you put that together with the rest of the production, now I'm sure you can hear that even in this setting that really works. But imagine that on a club sound system. With genres like tech house, you've often got an awful lot of hypnotic and repeating elements. So any types of contrast that you can build into your production like that will be an absolute winner. So now let's have a look at some of the effects patches in this particular production. We've got these great slams. Got a bit of high pass filter on this one. And as you can see from the screen here on the arrangement, it's actually automated, so it changes in different sections. Nice bit of drive will always help these kind of sounds. And some of the snap control as well will just bring the front up even more. Now we've also got an analog noise rise patch. This is a whole series of stereo noise samples taken directly from and post-processed from vintage synthesizers. And you can hit some notes, play some sounds in, and then rise up using the low pass filter and high pass filter macro controls. It's bread and butter stuff for effects, but it always works. But my favorite effects patches throughout this entire release are the Foley bombs and grunge loops. Now what we did is we went into Brighton and we took a whole series of Foley recordings at places like substations, lorry parks, all that kind of thing, looped it, and if it had any kind of pitch to it, we made sure that it was in one of the specific keys of the pack, that's G minor and D minor. And then we created some patches. Now these grunge bombs are actually downers using that material. By hitting different keys, you get different collections of the sounds playing at once. And bearing in mind, they're all tuned to the same key, so they're all going to work within your track. So on this particular one, it's quite subtle, but it adds a really organic feel to the bar start of the next section. They make such a great change to the standard kind of noise and synth effects that we're using all the time in production. So we really hope you get some great use out of that. But also do remember, as we're using simpler and sampler menu patches, you can just grab the entire patch and transpose it if you're not working in one of these keys. And that's why we actually tend to prefer using these kind of patches as opposed to drum racks in live, because it's so simple to just detune the entire sound set. Now the fun really starts. We're into the one-shot menus. We went on a massive sound design mission for this pack. Tech House particularly has been known for processed vocals, so we wanted to create a whole series of menus that really reflected that. Once again, these have all been tuned to the keys that we're working on here, G minor and D minor, but the macros have changed slightly. We've got a delay control and a reverb control here that are easily automatable as you're building stuff up throughout your production. Now, as I say, we had a great deal of fun doing these, and I can't recommend this kind of workflow enough to you guys. So actually stop what you're doing if you get stuck on a track, bounce it down into stereo, stick it up on a blank page, and just go completely into sound design mode and just make noise. Use any hardware you've got. That's always great fun to just grab controls and just really dive in. But don't think about the arrangement. Don't think about anything else apart from making great sounds. Then stick them into these kind of menu patches, and you'll have so much fun throwing them back into the production. I can't tell you. And when they kind of all come together, bits like this, they can really help your production stand apart. Now, they're not just vocals, obviously. We've got synth shots here. Now, as you can hear there, they're not just picking out the root note of the key, they're picking out certain other notes from the minor scale. So then that allows you to build up some really interesting parts. And once again, we got basic sound processing on the macros. Nothing drastic, but a great starting point, and certainly useful for automating as you're going through the track. Now, we've not just got one-shots. Obviously, tracks are famous for multi-sampled instruments, and here we've got some great stuff. We've sampled quite a few patches from a Prophet VS and an MKS 50 for this release. The MKS 50 is the rack mount version of the Roland Alpha Juno 2, which is famous for its Dominator Hoover sound. But it's also got a great chord mode that allowed us to capture this patch. Some other highlights here include a great tech harp. It's got a lot of ring modulation. Actually, at source there was a ring mod pedal, a guitar pedal used to record that through, and this lovely patch from the VS, the Prophet VS, called Dystopia. It's got real guts to it, the sound of the Prophet VS, and that's what happens when you've got early low-bit digital oscillators firing into classic analog filter chips. If you can pick up any instruments from that era, for example, the Waldorf Microwave 1, just do grab it. They really have something quite special and unique. Now, we've gone a long way with multi-sampling here at F9, but there are some parts of analog circuitry that just can't be replicated throughout the process. So we have, on pretty much all of the projects, added some actual effects files from different synthesizers. On this one, we've got some from a DSI Poly Evolver. Let's put them in solo, and we'll just play a few. And that's us grabbing the controls as it goes down, and there's just some of that stuff you just can't replicate. Okay, now let's move on to another project. But just before we do, one thing I want to say about the synth section of the sound library that is installable as racks. We have actually multi-sampled far more synths than were actually used in the projects. But rather than not include them, we thought we may as well just rack them up and give them to you whilst they were done. They all sound great. We literally couldn't physically get all of them onto the productions. So do have a good check through of some of the other sounds. This is the second production that we're going to go through. This is South Bank, and it's special because of one particular part. We're using a polyrhythm. Now that means it's a part that is not in a kind of standard bar length, so that when you loop it, it kind of sounds like it's constantly evolving, and we're talking here about this pluck sound. Now I've just got the part unlooped here, and as you can see, it's actually 3.5 bars long. But when we turn the loop on and actually move it back out, you'll see that the actual divisions, in other words, where it's starting to repeat, do not fall against the normal 4 or 8 bar sections. And that gives you this sense that it's just constantly changing. Now, you add some tasty automation to that. For example, on quite a lot of this, we're all constantly automating the low-pass filter settings. Then you can create these parts that have real motion. And as I say, because in Tech House there's an awful lot of repetition, anything you can do to grow sounds organically or just change the way the rhythms are working against each other is time well spent. So I really encourage you guys to actually try and look at these kind of things. You don't have to have parts that are weird lengths like 3.5 bars. Something like a 3-bar loop or a 5-bar loop. Looping will kind of offset the way that the repeats happen and create these polyrhythms. Now we've got 2 different versions of the pluck sound, one for the intro because there's no bass information at the beginning, so we can have a little bit more bass on the actual part. Whereas for the main section we're using a high pass filter that's coming off here at 228 Hertz, so that it's not going to get in the way of the bass. So even though we're using some low notes, it won't get in the way of our bass patch when it actually comes in. I've seen people try to do this kind of thing on automation, and we've got unlimited tracks in modern DAW, so it's always worth just thinking if it's going to be easier just to split an actual part like this out and do it that way, and just for each track have different sets of processing. Now let's quickly just roll back on this production a little bit and have a listen to the drums. So really nice and tight on this production, and it's being bounced along with this analog tom patch that's playing against the kick drum. Now, as you can see, the kick drum's actually an audio file in this one. We've recently had an MPC X come into the studio for some work. It's an amazing piece of technology. If you do get a chance, go and check it out. It is proper lust-worthy. It's got a gorgeous interface, and the touchscreen is second to none. And it also sounds the biz as well. That's why, with a little bit of hardware, we were able to create this really quite fronty little kick. Now, around the same time, we were doing some 80s stuff, and we had a original Oberheim DX drum machine in. It's only got a few sounds on it, and they're all stored actually on EEPROM chips. So we've got a high-pass filtered version of the kick drum here. And those 80s drum machines have got real bite in their sounds. Now let's just go back to the intro. There's also a kick drum reverb that's being used, and a kick click. So you add all of them together and you get this. Now for me, this is a perfect example of layering up kicks because everything is doing something different. You've already got one main bass element in there, and that's the first sound that came out of the MPC-X. Everything else is just kind of helping it and bolstering it along. Now there's one thing I do want to say about kicks whilst we're here. There is so much nonsense being talked on forums about keying your kick drums. Just forget it. Just don't do it. It's pointless and it's dangerous. The reason being is that if your bass tones are slightly out of phase and in the same key and using the same octave as your kick drum, they've only got to come together just in the wrong way, and it will actually eat information out of the bass end instead of bolstering it. Now, I'm going to do a whole video on this kind of thing because there's so much nonsense being talked out there that it's actually quite frightening. Take it from me, you just use your ears. Do not worry about keying your kick drums to a certain track. It's different if you're in hip-hop and you're using 808s and that kind of thing where the tones effectively become the basses. But for house and stuff like that, as I say, just use your ears. If the kick's not working, change it for another one. Don't sit there and panic about what the fundamental of the note is. We can't even hear note pitches underneath about 50 or 60 hertz. So there's just no point worrying about it. As long as they don't interfere and as long as they bolster each other, it's the right kick. So we've got some tasty other patches on this particular production. We've got these glitchy tops. They're adding some real class and interest to the rhythm track. We've actually got an audio file of a live hi-hat. So it's kind of looping, or it sounds like it's looping, but every hit is slightly different. And just adding that little live element to this can really make all of the difference. We've also got some other sounds from the DX. The shakers from those old 8-bit drum machines always work. They're just massive. I suppose it's because the sounds were heavily compressed before they were burnt onto these 8-bit EEPROMs. Now, the Oberheim DX, unlike its older brother, the DMX, actually had tuning buttons or tuning knobs on the back of the unit. So you can take the standard sounds and really crunch them up. Add a bit of reverb to them and they really have something. This is the clap sound from the DX detuned and put in. It's weird, isn't it? We've got all of this beautiful 24-bit, completely pristine audio, and we spend all of our lives trying to hark back to old 8 or 12-bit sounds. Now, in a couple of places, we've got that clap sound going into a gargantuan reverb, thanks to our brilliant Otto BAM desktop reverb processor. Okay, so on the effects front in this release, we've actually used the DX symbol because it just has something thrown into a load of delays. Hear that? All that low bit action, it just does something great to the top end, doesn't it? A great selection of reverse hits on a sampler menu. Some reverbed drums. Now, when you're crossing across into different sections of a track and your drums are nice and crisp and dry, having a few big reverb noises like this can really make all the difference. Now, I'd always suggest with sounds like that, don't actually put them on the downbeat, put them on the quarter beat or the half beat of the bar before, or even just 1/16 before it's going to happen. It can really add some great movement to your transitions. Okay, so now let's just go through some of the other synth sounds in this. Let's have a quick look at the bass. We're using our virus or viral bass. But we're actually using a degree of frequency modulation on it. Now, this wasn't available for the Logic version, so we think the bass sound in this one's actually slightly superior. We could also spread it out, but it's quite nice as it stands. We've got some great sounds from the DSI Poly Evolver, including this filth patch. And this one, a kind of nice plucky. Speaking of vintage, we do have some sustained pad lead sounds. It's bolstered up with two different sounds. And when played together, they really sound nice and fat. Now there we're actually just holding down one note and then using the mod wheel to move up a whole tone and then back down a whole tone. Now in a minor scale, you can do that around the root and you'll get that effect. Every now and again, someone in the music hardware industry has a brainwave and does something completely mental, and it often doesn't work because it's just too crazy. In the 90s, someone came up with this amazing synth called the Hartman Neuron. It uses a neural network as part of its processing, and it basically tears quite simple samples apart and then pieces them back together. We've not ever come across anything that either A, looks like this from a physical point of view and also sounds like it. It's almost impossible to multi-sample, so we've got some sounds added in on this production. There's a few more here. And we've used them heavily within the transitions. Now, it's not complicated by today's resynthesis processes, but it just has a sound of its own, like many things from that day. Now, it is basically just a PC in a very expensive box, so it can go completely mental at any time. So we are hoping to try and capture as many loops from it and as sounds as humanly possible over the next few years. Okay, so we're going to move to another production now because this video is starting to get epic. This is the third page. This is Mombasa. So we've got some of our SP12 tech basses running away there. We've got the main rolling one, which is bass M, and then we've got these alt basses, which are picking out notes every now and again. It just shows you how well those sounds gel together. But one of the big things that I want to show you in this production is that in the breakdown sections, it actually moves from the musical root note, which is G, to the musical fifth of that key, which is D. Now, the reason that has such dramatic impact is that when you move from the fifth of a key back down to the root, we are pre-programmed as human beings to like that. It's one of the most simple and powerful resolutions in music. It was used to great effect on the Chemical Brothers' classic Hey Boy, Hey Girl. Now, we didn't make our lives easy by using two different bass sounds here. And in the second section that goes back to D minor, we've actually got a high energy kind of bass sound. But one thing I want to draw your attention to, if we go to the front of each bar, you'll see that the first note is actually missing. Now, this is a great little trick on 16th bass lines like that. For some reason, it just makes it sound a little bit cooler because the kick comes in and takes the place. So when you've got rolling 16th bass lines like that, just finding a few notes to actually pull out can really make all the difference. Now, we're actually using some of the additional loops that were created specially for this pack, like this Process Tech Vox loop. And this one. Now, we really do encourage you to go through a lot of the additional content that we've got here. It's available in a folder, and as we said earlier, it's all pre-warped, so you can just drag it into any project. It will loop, and you can just repeat it. The ASD files are written, it's in the right warp mode, it will sound good. There's tons of different content. We really like the tops that come off of the Digitact. But the cream of the crop is definitely these tech vocal loops. A great deal of sound design work went into all of them. And don't forget, we also have one project where they're all set up in session view. Now, in VST land, we live in a very synth-rich world. Seems every single week there's a brand new wavetable, multi-oscillated, stacking, crazy filtered synth coming out. And every now and again, it's great to go back to basics. When we got hold of the Arturia Mini Brute, we were really pleasantly surprised what a one-oscillator synth with a great filter can do, particularly when you're making slightly acidic sounds. Now, there's a reason why sounds like that have been so popular from the last 30 years of dance music. They just cut like butter through a mix. We couldn't believe how simple it was to place that particular patch into any of these productions. So don't overlook the more simpler side of synthesis in favour of just the crazy complex stuff. Now, there's a couple of other sounds that we've got in here that are really interesting. We've got these Diva Atmos hits. Now, although these sound like they're just heavily reverberant, they're not. They're actually from a little application called Pulse Stretch that, even though it's a Windows application, has been converted into a form that will work on a Mac as well. Now, this was made famous by taking a Justin Bieber 3-minute pop song and turning it into a 30-minute soundscape. It's well worth checking out. I think it's also built into certain versions of Audacity as well. And we just put a few vocal notes in there and just let it do its thing. We've also used the same sample set here to create risers that are modulated. The filter cutoff is changing with the modulation wheel. So by grabbing a few keys there and just pushing them down, you can kind of draw in a nice riser that makes a real change from just static synth sounds. Now, I've just had a look at the timer and this video is starting to get really long, so we're probably going to stop here. But there's one more sound that I want to draw your attention to in this production, and it's a slightly atonal loop that runs throughout the entire course of the track. Now, that sits really nicely across the production. Now, if I take it out at the front and then put it back in, it just adds that extra bit of sonic interest. Now, we're fascinated by this at F9, and I personally believe that the human brain does not like purity. It needs some chaos, it needs some real-world sounds behind it, and a little bit of grunge. Now, there is a parallel in the film industry where either grunge layers or things like 35mm film noise are applied on top of pure, pristine digital video, and we seem to appreciate them an awful lot more when that happens. So really bear this in mind when you're producing. Sometimes having noise beds like that in the background can make all the difference. So that's it for this walkthrough of the Ableton version of the F9 TRAX Release Motion V1 Tech House. Please don't forget that we've only been through 3 of the sessions that are available within this pack. There's another 2 to actually go through. You've got all of those startup pages and all of the additional content and instruments. We hope you get great use out of this pack. And if you do make something huge, don't forget to let us know at info@f9-audio.com. Thanks for watching this walkthrough, and we'll see you next time.